The story of Jeanne d'Arc, better known to the English-speaking world as Joan of Arc, is not that of a typical medieval commoner who got herself swept up in the tides of history. From the humblest beginnings to being one of the prime players in the 100 Years' War, Jeanne's life is filled with extraordinary events that bring her from the quiet obscurity of rural France to the center of one of Europe's most intense military and political struggles. What makes the story of Jeanne d'Arc so special, almost mythical in character, is not just her military victories on the battlefield and her visions of God, but rather how life and death have been interpreted and reinterpreted over centuries. The childhood of Jeanne d'Arc, a girl from Domrémy. Domrémy, northeastern France, Lorraine region, was where Jeanne d'Arc was born around 1412. Her family was of the peasant class, her father, Jacques d'Arc, working as a farmer, her mother, Isabelle Romé, seeing to it that the household ran well. The childhood of Jeanne was unremarkable, since most girls in the peasant world tended animals, worked in the fields, and learned the ways of rural France. However, her childhood was deeply affected by the war between the English and the French that had been on and off for almost 100 years when Jeanne reached her teens. The 100 Years' War, initiated in 1337, was more or less of a dynastic dispute over the throne of France. By the early 15th century, the war had taken such a dire toll on France. In league with the Burgundians, the English held much of northern France, even Paris itself. The French Dauphin, that is, the heir to the throne, Charles VII, had dubious legitimacy in the eyes of many, while the people of France had been dispirited by constant losses on the battlefield. Wrapped up in the war were questions of sovereignty and national identity, both of which would come to define Jeanne d'Arc's mission. Much of France was effectively under English rule at the time of Jeanne's birth, and many believed that the French crown was on the verge of being extinguished entirely. The divine voices. It was a transformation in her life when she started to get, at age 13, what she termed the voices of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. According to her, the voices asked her to help the Dauphin Charles regain his throne and lead the French to drive away the English. Visions of this kind were anything but unique for medieval France, imbued as it was with religious transports, but clarity and direction, a clear message of what the speaker should do, were indeed exceptional in Jeanne's claims. Since the very childhood, Jeanne has been deeply religious. In her later testimonies before the judges during her trial, her visions were other than personal religious experiences. They were clear messages from God, a summon for a specific, almost impossible task. She was convinced that she was summoned to save France and to restore Charles VII to his rightful place as king. The voices dictated that she should go to Chinon, where the Dauphin was residing, and also to notify him of her mission from above. This belief in her heavenly calling would be the spur to all the subsequent actions of Jeanne. Since she happened to be a young, illiterate girl who never saw or handled arms in her life, Jeanne displayed unparalleled determination. At 16, she persuaded a local lord, Robert de Baudricourt, to give her an escort to Chinon to see the Dauphin. That she could persuade hardened soldiers and nobles alike to take her seriously is testimony to her force of personality and the desperate state in which France then found itself. Meeting with Charles VII and the siege of Orléans. It was not until the beginning of 1429 that Jeanne finally arrived at Chinon and was ushered in to see the Dauphin. Charles was desperate to find confirmation of his claim to be France's rightful monarch, so he was intrigued yet cautious. Not wanting to commit himself to someone he was not sure was a real emissary from God, he sent her on to Poitiers, where theologians and some sort of scholars interrogated her, and he could find some corroboration that she was indeed genuine. She eventually gained the impression of being earnest and orthodox in her faith, and Charles yielded reluctantly to give a try to her. Thereupon, her first severe test emerged at the siege of Orléans. The city of Orléans had been under siege by the English for some months. Its fall would have spelt catastrophe to the French cause. She appeared at the siege armoured, with a banner bearing the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of France, in April 1429. Her presence galvanized the French troops because they viewed her as a divinely inspired leader. Jeanne, though without military training or experience, was instrumental in lifting the siege. Her influence lay not so much in battlefield tactics as in morale. the belief in them that they were fighting under the banner of some kind of holy figure translated to several victories. After a series of aggressive assaults, Joan and the French army compelled the English to raise the siege, a turning point in the 100 Years' War. It was the first major victory that the French had enjoyed in years, and much of the credit was given to Jeanne d'Arc. The Coronation of Charles VII. Following the victory at Orléans, Jeanne's next goal was to have Charles VII consecrated as the rightful King of France. At the time, he was uncrowned, since the traditional site of French coronations, the cathedral at Reims-Deeply, lay in enemy territory. Jeanne felt Charles needed to be anointed upon the throne to stabilize his claim and rally the French around him. Next, Jeanne boldly led Charles and his army on a march to Reims. On the way, the army made capture after capture of key towns. Charles was finally crowned King Charles VII in full ceremony on July 17, 1429, at Reims, with Jeanne attending and holding her banner. This crowning of Charles was quite a significant moment, for the restoration of the French monarchy and its legitimacy included restoring their national independence. Without her interference, this would not have happened. Charles would likely have remained the figure of dispute and weakness, and without any serious chance to regain the crown. Capture and execution of Jeanne. Despite her successes, however, Jeanne's fortunes were soon to take a darker turn. In May 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne against the Burgundian siege, she was captured by Burgundian forces aligned with the English. Without attempting to ransom her seriously, the French King Charles VII allowed Jeanne to be handed over to the English. In her enemy's hands, Jeanne was put on trial that was more political than judicial. She was charged with heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing for donning male military attire, which she had done throughout her campaigns. Her trial was in Rouen, entrusted to a pro-English bishop, Pierre Cauchon. The charges against her were religious, yet simultaneously politically circular, for they would render illegal the crowning of Charles VII, to which Jeanne was a party. In this way, if the proof that Jeanne was indeed a heretic or an impostor could be obtained, then Charles was illegally a king. The trial was fixed from the start. This 19-year-old girl was denied the right to legal counsel and was made to defend herself before the court of learned clerics. Yet, she showed remarkable composure and steadfastness throughout the trial, and continued to assert that her voices were from God and the execution of her actions was an act of will ordained by God himself. After months of relentless interrogation and pressure, Jeanne was convicted of heresy and sentenced to death. Execution and legacy. It was in Rouen that Jeanne d'Arc was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431, at 19 years old. Her execution was to silence her and a blow to the French cause. It was exactly the opposite. Jeanne, with time, would become an icon for the resistance and French nationalism. Her martyrdom strengthened her heritage, and she would later be rehabilitated by the Church. The posthumous retrial that took place in 1456 declared Jeanne innocent of all charges brought against her. The Pope at the time, Calixtus III, ordered the retrial as a procedural vindication of Jeanne's name so as to establish her as a martyr. Her canonization as a saint would come much later, in 1920, when the Catholic Church officially recognized her as Saint Joan of Arc. Jeanne d'Arc's impact. Jeanne d'Arc's life and death had a deep influence on French national identity. It became a rallying point for the French in the remainder of the 100 Years' War, and the role that Jeanne played in the eventual victory against the English cannot be underestimated. More than a military leader, Jeanne became a symbol of divine favor and of national unity at a time when France was literally on the brink of collapse. Her impact extended beyond her life, even beyond the crises of the French Revolution and the Franco-Prussian War, when Jeanne d'Arc was harnessed for strength and patriotism. By the 20th century, she became a national heroine, a symbol of struggle for freedom and common folks' rights. To this day, Jeanne d'Arc is one of the most powerful images of French nationalism. Her story also had great implications for the role of women in history. Jeanne's military command and her great height within the French court really challenged the traditional medieval perception of gender roles. At a time when women were generally excluded from political life and military, Jeanne's prominence brought to the fore the capabilities of women in exercising authority and commanding respect in conventionally male-dominated areas. Her example would serve as a potent symbol for generations of women afterwards to rebel against the constraints society has imposed upon their behaviors. Throughout history, the roles of women have been largely domestic in nature, yet the rise to leadership by Jeanne d'Arc opposed expectations wholesale. She led men into battle and dictated the course of action by kings and military strategists. While some of her contemporaries considered her behavior unnatural or even dangerous, insofar as she flouted the conventions attributed to her sex, many others, most of those who fought with and for her, foregrounded her fortitude, self-control, and authority. This revealing paradox of idealization and mistrust was part of larger social fears associated with female authority in the period when the Catholic Church and the grand monarchies were extremely patriarchal organizations. Gender and religious symbolism. It meant a lot to the status of women in medieval Christian society, as the gender and religious symbolism are intertwined in Jeanne's life. Jeanne, by claiming divine visions, gained an unparalleled authority as she went around her gender. The bond she had with God's will that she claimed at trial accorded her a sphere that was otherwise inaccessible to other women. Thus, by framing her actions in terms of God's will, Jeanne legitimized her leadership in a way that bypassed the conventional male-headed hierarchy altogether. Her donning of manly garb, in fact armor, created controversy at her trial as the judges attempted to portray her as an outlier to norms due to her gender-bending ways. However, Jeanne's use of men's clothes was not only functional for a military leader, but also symbolic in many ways. She became a soldier by donning armor and thus violated the gendered order of her time. This feature of her persona was to be one of the central issues of her trial, for the Church could easily condemn cross-dressing as a disobedience to the Scriptures, while to her more convinced contemporaries, it proved her single-minded attention to her divinely ordained mission. Canonization and the construction of an icon. Jeanne's influence was increasingly developed over the centuries following her execution. The formal recognition of her sainthood came in 1920, when the Roman Catholic Church canonized her. It was both a reflection of the intense connection that she had with the French nation and of her religious meaning. Jeanne's canonization was a recognition that her unique place within the French historical imagination expressed two quests, religious and national salvation. Her beatification and subsequent canonization were as much political events as religious ones. The 19th and 20th centuries were ages of acute nationalism in Europe, and France in particular grappled with the legacies of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Franco-Prussian War. In the face of such turmoil, France was trying to establish one firm national identity and mend internal divisions, in which Jeanne d'Arc was an exemplary figure to whom both religious and secular authorities could rally. During France's Third Republic, rife with combative discourse between secularists and the Catholic Church, the image of Jeanne d'Arc was mobilized in the service of the cause of representing a unifying figure. Both Republicans and monarchists claimed her legacy as their own to justify different visions of France's future. To Catholics, she was the embodiment of piety and divine favor. To Republicans, she was a patriot who fought against foreign domination. This double legacy cemented Jeanne's place as a permanent icon for both faith and national pride. Jeanne d'Arc in popular culture and memory. Jeanne's story has permeated popular culture in various forms, from literature and theatre to film and art. Works about her life, written by the likes of Voltaire, Mark Twain, and George Bernard Shaw, among others, have chosen to emphasize different parts of her life, and more often than not, focus on her humanness as much as on her saintliness. In George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, for example, Jeanne is somewhat a character out of her times, challenging both political and religious authority. Shaw's Jeanne is neither a fanatic nor a victim, but a conviction of a person who can shape history with her will. The pictorial representation of Joan has also contributed much to her undying legend. Paintings, sculptures, and later films have portrayed her in various ways, sometimes as a saintly figure, at other times as a warrior or martyr. In the silent film era, The Passion of Joan of Arc by Carl Theodor Dreyer, created in 1928, is considered one of the most haunting representations regarding her trial and execution, showing the emotional and spiritual intensity of her last days. In the 20th and 21st centuries, her story has continued to inspire secular and religious interpretations. The feminist movement has adopted Jeanne d'Arc as a symbol of what women can do in leadership or against the status quo. Her defiance of gender norms and her unwavering belief in her mission have made her a powerful figure in feminist discourse. Meanwhile, political leaders across the spectrum have invoked her as a symbol of nationalism, particularly during times of war or political crisis. The image of Jeanne d'Arc has been used to represent a defender of national sovereignty, to justify both liberal and conservative causes. Jeanne d'Arc's legacy in French nationalism. One of the most continuous legacies of Jeanne d'Arc has to do with the construction of modern French nationalism. At the turn of the 19th century, following the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, the country was undergoing deep social and political transformations. As France grappled with modernization, industrialization, and the loss of its status as the predominant European power, Jeanne's story accounted for at least one pole of continuity with the past. More than anything, interest in the image of Jeanne d'Arc as a token of French resistance reached new intensity in light of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71. After the humiliating defeat of France and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Prussia, Jeanne's story of resisting foreign occupation hit hard among the French populace. Her connection with the defense of the French territory made her an ideal figure for those who called for the recovery of national pride and unity. Statues of Jeanne went up all over France. Her feast day, the 30th of May, was made a day of national commemoration. During the First World War, Jeanne would be mobilized as a symbol of French resistance against the invading German army. Soldiers at the front called her for inspiration, and her figure was on the propaganda posters of this time, calling for unity and sacrifice. Insofar as Jeanne herself had connections with the military tradition of France, coupled with her religious appeal, she was well placed to personify the cause that the French army and the Catholic Church mounted during these years of turmoil. Still, her legacy as a unifying figure has been embraced by various political movements. The French far right, and most notably the Front National, now rebranded as Rassemblement National, has regularly used the image of Jeanne d'Arc in campaigns, framing her as an avatar for French nationalism and resistance against foreign influence. This has cast debates on what would be the true meaning of Jeanne's legacy and if her story should be connected to certain political agendas. The continuing strength of Jeanne d'Arc's saga. Jeanne d'Arc, from the various levels of significance attached to her life and legacy, is a character in whom it is spellbindingly compelling. From being an illiterate young peasant girl who rose to national significance as inspired by God, the history becomes one that reflects faith, gender, power, and identity. Her military exploits, however spectacular on their own, are just but part of the history that endears her as an important figure in history. Her challenging of the mores of society, her influencing of national politics, and the stamp she has left on both French and world history all bear witness to the extraordinary quality of her life. The reinterpretations of Jeanne's life across the centuries, from her vilification in her trial, to her canonization, to her standing today as a national icon, are representative of an evolving nature in the meaning of her existence. Jeanne d'Arc is not just a figure from medieval times, but a symbolic figure of conviction, complicated notions of nation, and the eternal quest for justice. Her story, though firmly rooted in the political and military conflicts of the 15th century, continued to reverberate into modern times as each generation finds new meaning in the life of the Maid of Orleans. From a humble peasant to a national heroine and saint, the story of Jeanne d'Arc is one of faith, defiance, and unyielding conviction. Her legacy has transcended centuries, influencing political movements, cultural works, and religious traditions. If you found this exploration of her extraordinary life inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history's most compelling figures. After all, sometimes the most remarkable legacies are those forged by those who dared to stand against the tide. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.